little bit more about my background at CHI Health Good Samaritan in Kearney, Nebraska. I'm the half-time stroke coordinator for our acute care program, and then I'm half-time inpatient rehab coordinator. So it's kind of a unique role. So a little bit about what do I do on the inpatient rehab side. I've done a lot of different things. I have my nursing home administrator's license. We used to have a skilled unit and a rehab unit, and throughout the course of time, we're to the point where we have a 13-bed inpatient rehab unit, and then I took on that other role. So as far as a coordinator position, any of you have heard of IRFPIs, MDSs in the skilled world, OASIS in home health. So those are things that I do, and then I do all the regulatory kinds of things, patient staff education, and then lead team meetings and so forth. So anyway, I also been a discharge planner for years. That's really how I started out my career. And so I've led to different management positions, and I still fill in on the floor once a week. So it's very fresh. So learning objectives that we're going to talk about today are, we're going to identify tools and resources to assist with post-stroke discharge planning. We're going to compare and contrast various post-acute stroke rehabilitation settings based on different patient characteristics. And it was kind of hard to even put my arms around this topic, so I framed it in a top 10 framework, so that's what we're going to talk about. Review top 10 discharge lists to assist with discharge planning, and then there is a case study that I'd like to spend some time talking about to identify different recommendations for post-stroke rehabilitation and recommended resources. So this is the hospital that I work at. I don't know, have any of you guys been to Nebraska at all? I know we have some Nebraska people. All right, some Nebraska people back there that are here, so love it. So this is a hospital where I work. So when you think of Nebraska, I am like smack dab in the middle of Nebraska. So I am in the rural setting of Nebraska, not on the eastern side where we have Lincoln and Omaha. But we do have a primary stroke center. We're a comprehensive acute care level 2 trauma center. And a variety of other things. We do have our own transport, which is kind of nice. We have our own helicopter and long-distance ambulance service. So basically what that means is we have a lot of patients that come into us from critical access hospitals and then stay with us for our inpatient rehab and post-acute care services. A little bit about the inpatient rehab side. We see about 250 patients a year, and out of those patients, 20% of those are stroke patients. And as far as going home, about 80% of our stroke patients go to a community discharge setting. In our acute care hospital, our census runs between, I'd say, 90 and 100. I don't know, we probably have 200 beds, but just based on staffing capacities and what we can do, that's what our hospital looks like there. So I just wanted to share with you a little bit about Nebraska. Montana is just incredible. We've just enjoyed the beauty. We drove up from Nebraska, went through the park, and found out we have some things that are in common. One, the Missouri River that's here, and that's a part on the eastern part of the state, and this is the North Platte River. See lots of cornfields in Nebraska, very crop heavy, rancher heavy with cows and calves. Probably heard of the Huskers. We have football, volleyball, those are the things that we lay claim to. And we are fortunate to have some beautiful lakes too, and actually even in the winter we have bald eagles, so some similar things to the beautiful state here. All right, when I was talking about Nebraska, Nebraska really is a very rural state, so I think there's a lot of commonalities between Nebraska and Montana, and I'm going to point out a few of those. So let's see, clicker. So we are right here, and as far as our catchment area for our hospital is this entire area here. And so we say that roughly it's the size of the state of Indiana is where our patients come from to our hospital. So critical access hospitals are key to how we service the medical care of Nebraska. All of these are critical access hospitals, and basically we are, I am going way ahead. So we are right in the middle, right here. And so you can see the distance it takes for these patients to get into an acute care hospital, which there's a lot of conversation that could take place with acute stroke management. But the point is, once these patients come into our hospital for acute care management, where do they dismiss to? So what's that discharge plan look like? Are we able to get them directly back to their communities? Will they go to a rehab center in a more urban area, or what are we going to do? So being the social worker that I am, I'm like, okay, well, we have to figure out what our resources are, step one. So I'm like, okay, how does Montana and Nebraska compare? So if you look at population, Nebraska has, more populated states, more people living there. But take a look at the size. Montana is more than double the size. So you have a vast area that you're serving the patients. What's it look like for hospitals? Montana has, this is according to Medicare.gov, when I looked at this right before I came to the presentation conference here. So hospitals, Montana has 63, Nebraska has 92. Critical access hospitals, Montana has 49, Nebraska has 63. Inpatient rehab programs, Montana has 4, Nebraska has 10. For SNF, Montana has 60, Nebraska 184, and those are getting less by the day. We have SNFs closing all the time in our state. I don't know what it's like here, but staffing is just a significant issue, and so they cannot staff them, and they're closing, which makes it harder and harder to dismiss your patients. Home health care, 24 in Montana and 66 in Nebraska. And long-term acute care hospital, there's 1 in Billings and 3 in Nebraska. Does that sound right to you guys? Yep. So then some things that we have in common also is the Montana Stroke Initiative. We've had that from Nebraska, Mission Lifeline Stroke, and the Brain Injury Alliance. That is just fantastic, all the work that they do here, and we have one in Nebraska as well. And I was just talking to the other table, I can't remember the name of it, but we have what's called ATP, which is what you guys have here, where you can get all those resources that you can loan out to your patients. So a lot of similarities, so that's great to see that work that's taking place. Okay, so moving on, why is discharge planning with stroke patients so challenging? Well, there's lots of reasons, and there's no fairy dust. So I'm hoping that you'll be able to take some of these nuggets home with you, a few pieces of this, and I'm eager to hear if you have some other, great things that you would want to share with the group as well. So, okay, one of the reasons is they almost all have some kind of ongoing rehab need. As you know, as far as stroke disability, 2/3 or more of patients are going to have some sort of a long-term disability post-stroke. There's a social, psychological, and emotional impact. We've heard about that in prior lectures today. And what's the prior functional status of the patient before they had a stroke? Were they getting along well? Were they super healthy? Or were they already having difficulty with using a walker, having a difficult time getting around? Then you add a stroke on top of that. That complicates things. What's their support system like? Are they married? Is their spouse able-bodied? Or do they live alone a long ways from any community resources? Financial needs, we're going to talk about that both from the insurance side and also what does it look like if you're the breadwinner and now you've had a stroke and you're not able to work. How are you going to support yourself and your family? Medical needs, many stroke patients have a lot of comorbidities that we need to address and look at. What do community resources look like? Transition planning is difficult because rehab recovery doesn't happen in just one stage. It's an ongoing transition for a long period of time. Transportation is critical. Rarely post-stroke is a patient able to drive, and so how are they going to get to the places they need, and how are they going to get supplies? And then the importance of returning to their prior lifestyle. Like, what brings meaning to you? How can we reconnect with that? So those are the challenges. All right, so now where do we start? So every patient is different medically, socially, and what resources are available. There's different levels of care from home health, outpatient therapy, SNF, swing bed, long-term acute care hospital, and of course, inpatient rehab. And that's actually the preferred level of care per research because of the fact of the intensity of the therapy that's provided in that setting. And we'll talk more about that in just a minute. Okay, starting down, our top 10 list. So number 1, stroke recovery and rehab needs. Post-acute care options and resources. So things have changed in that category throughout the years. Providers' criteria has changed with who they will admit in regards to funding. We want to make sure there's a funding source in place before many providers will admit. And they also want to know what the discharge plan is. It's not good enough now just to have a discharge plan to go to rehab or go to skilled, but what's the plan after that? And so that's been a real change, I think, for acute care, care management, because that was their job, just move them on to the next spot where they can get the best services possible. But now everybody in that next service line is asking, what's the next discharge plan? So just looking at Montana here, just location, the vast amount of territory that you have in Montana, and then the tourists. In the summer when it's just the parks are filled and strokes happen so frequently, what do you do when you have your tourist that has a stroke, and how are they going to be managed? So we're going to talk a little bit about a rehab guide review just to help know what your resources are. So I've got a couple slides from a presentation that was previously put together. Beth Molina is a part of this group that was the founders of this resource and this part of these slides here. And they're in Nebraska. We have a Mission Lifeline Rehab Task Force that this is their work that they did to put this together and did a lot of research. And just shout out to all of the people involved with that group. And we're going to go through and take a look at that tool. So in your packets, if you want to take those out, it's a guide, looks like this. And so this was a guide that was developed in Nebraska, but it's available for anybody to use, and I am so happy to see that Montana has adopted this guide. So please use this every day, every chance you have the opportunity to talk about discharge planning for stroke rehab. So the whole purpose of this guide is to provide a research-based framework for discharge planning. And so you can use this with your social workers, case managers, nurses, physicians, therapists, and it will go through and talk about the different discharge options that are available for post-acute stroke rehabilitation. So this aligns with the clinical practice guidelines for 2016 that we have been talking about earlier, guidelines for adult stroke rehabilitation and recovery. So just a little history about the guide. That clinical practice guideline was put out in 2016, and then in 2017, there was another guide put out, Making Rehab Decisions, was published. And then the Rehab Task Force spent about a year researching different literature in regards to decision making, and then they went forward on putting this together, and they had some support through Mission Lifeline Stroke Grant to assist with the development of the tool. And then 2018 and then in 2021 was when it was able to be put together and it was to be published. So this next slide, I know you can't see this from back there, but there's 13 recommendations that come from that guideline. And the ones with the arrows by them all have to do with specifically related to discharge planning. There's also pieces in there that talk about depression and depression screening, the aphasia, swallow screening, all those things we talked about earlier. But these are particularly the ones that are clinically based for the research in regards to discharge planning. So basically the guide consists of two parts. One is a discharge planning pathway, and the other one has comparison tables. So we'll start with the pathway. So once somebody has a stroke, there's a couple different things that need to happen after they're released from the acute care hospital. So you need to think about, what's that rehab going to look like? Do they need rehab from an inpatient side? If they need it from an inpatient side, you're going to be looking at an inpatient rehab facility, skilled or long-term acute care hospital. Or if they're doing well enough and they can go directly home, be looking at things from an outpatient home care perspective, or traditional outpatient therapy program. Some places have rehab day programs, and then also there's home health. Now there's a little caveat to that, because there are a couple patients that this may not fit at all. So there's some patients that post-stroke that they've returned completely to their premorbid functional status. They're at their baseline, no rehab needed, they just go home directly from acute care. Or there might be some patients that just decline rehab altogether, just not going to do it, not interested, and that's completely fine. So this is really the pathway that a person would follow. And then in here, this goes through and talks about the comparison tables, and I'm not going to go through all of this in great detail, but a couple things I did want to point out include the medical services. So that's the second one down where the star is. So in a rehab hospital or rehab program, you're going to have daily physician visits. They're required. Right now it's like 3 face-to-face by a physiatrist 3 times a week. Most of the time they are going to have a physician visit on a daily basis. Skilled unit, you would not see a physician on a regular basis. In a long-term care, acute care hospital, you'd probably see more of an internist because you're going to have more significant medical needs than you would on the rehab side. It's kind of a combination need of what the patient would have. So those are things to think about. So when you're explaining inpatient rehab to somebody, this is like a point that I would make to them so they fully understand the rehab physician-provider concept. And then we look at the therapy intensity, and this has been talked about a little bit already, which is 3 hours a day, 5 days a week minimum. Many times patients receive actually a little bit more therapy than that. And there is the ability in rehab hospitals to do a 15-hour-a-week rule plan, and that would be like for our dialysis patients, that because of whatever reason, they're just not going to be able to get 3 hours of therapy in every single day. So we can alter that slightly. And then you can see where things fall out for skilled. The therapy intensity would not be as great, or in a long-term care, acute care hospital, because they also have the medical needs to contend with. Okay, so in a rehab hospital, one of the things that we really look at on admission is what's the likelihood of this patient being able to return to a community setting. We really want to see patients that we can help get home again, and those would be patients that also would potentially discharge to an assisted living. We consider that a community setting. In our length of stay in a rehab unit, like our length of stay was 12.6 days, and for stroke patients it's a little bit longer. It's like 13, not quite 14 days. So I always tell people, like in about 2 weeks period of time, is it reasonable to think that we're going to be able to get this patient home? Which comes first? Is a skilled setting stay for, the priority first, or inpatient rehab? It's different for every patient because the sooner we can get more intense therapy going, the hope is that the response and recovery will be quicker and faster. And then just a quick little bit on the outpatient side of things. So as far as nursing services, that's one of the things that's most significantly different. Traditional outpatient, you're not going to have any nursing services available. For a rehab day program, nursing would be available for support services, and for home health, nursing also is a component. So that's something that you want to consider for discharge planning. And then as far as the type of patient needs, the biggest difference here is the patient able to get out and about, or are they going to be what's considered homebound? And so, it's really a decision by, the therapy team with what they recommend, and then also what works for the patient and family and what resources are available in their community. So to complement that, there's also another guide that's in your packet, and this can be given to patients. It's a scaled down version. It's smaller, more simple to describe all the resources. So also would really recommend sharing that as well. The guide that we just went through, I think, give that to every student group you talk to, nurses, therapists, even physicians, if you have the chance. Sometimes they're not 100% clear on the differences between all the programs. Every time we go out and we talk about the rehab program to some of our critical access hospitals, we take that out and about, because you can just not educate and communicate that enough, so please use it. Okay, we're going to move on to number 2. So what is healthcare without talking about funding? And I hate to have that be such a driving force, but when it comes to discharge planning, it certainly is. So insurance for healthcare needs, you need to have it in some fashion or another. So in regards to funding, what does that look like? So prior authorization, is that something that's needed or not? So if a person has traditional Medicare A and B, there's no authorization needed to come to an inpatient rehab facility. To go to a skilled setting, you have to have 3 overnights in a hospital to qualify for Medicare to pay. So usually working with Medicare A and B, you can move them through the system pretty quickly without having delays for pre-authorization. Let's talk about Medicare Advantage plans. Any of you work with Medicare Advantage plans? Yeah, a few. I know. I was talking to a colleague I met at my table, and we're like, yeah. They're out there and they're growing. It's just one of those things that we have to embrace and figure out how to work with them. They're not going to go away. I think there has been some new legislation put forward in regards to how they're supposed to be operating. I just listened to a webinar on that, which is good. But with Medicare Advantage plans, Medicaid, and commercial insurance, you have to have pre-authorizations for anything that you're going to do for post-acute care planning. So with the Advantage plans, there's a 60% rule for inpatient rehab. So if a patient with a stroke is a part of that rule, most of the time they'll approve rehab for that patient. If they're not a part of that 60% rule, it's very difficult to get Medicare Advantage plans to authorize inpatient rehab. So you need to consider it's a 48 to 72 hour turnaround time for most authorizations. When you send those in, they can tell you like, oh, this could take up to 14 days to get, feedback back to you. And you're like, what? That's a rehab stay, and you're going to have this patient hang out on acute care for 2 weeks until you get this authorized. So we always put it in as an urgent request, and usually if you request an urgent request, then they'll, try to turn that around in 24 to 48 hours. So make sure you put that in when you submit your authorization. So here's a tip. You want to submit good therapy notes. And so when we go ahead and we're going to authorize, pre-authorize for inpatient rehab, the therapist will let them know, like, hey, we're putting authorization in tomorrow. And the case manager always says, well, do we have good notes? Because if you don't have good notes, there's just no reason to even go through the process. Just wait till you have some good notes to submit. So my recommendation would be to always use some sort of standardized testing to really clearly, objectively state what the deficits are of that patient. So in your handouts, there's some more work. This is a result of some of the work from the Nebraska Stroke Rehab Task Force. So for the therapists in the room, I'd really encourage you to use these tests and communicate with your care manager when you're going to request authorization for this patient. You also, when you hopefully get authorization for your next continued stay review, it's a good time to retest them, and so then you can submit those notes as well. So I'll give you an example of what that looks like. So say you have a patient that came in, had a stroke, pretty significant stroke, but in the next couple days in acute care, they're really doing pretty good. So, therapists are documenting the patient's walking, 50 feet, contact guard assist with a front wheel walker. So you're like, wow, this guy's making a good recovery, right? So, insurance could look at that and say, well, they're not really very far off from being, standby, independent, able to go home. Their needs could be served in a less intense setting, skilled or outpatient. And you're like, well, yeah, maybe that could work. But then, look at it from the view of, okay, this guy was a rancher. He was out on the ranch, no device, pulling calves, scooping snow, whatever you're all doing on the ranch or farming. Walking 50 feet with a walker, is that where we want to be? No, we are light years difference from where we want to be. So it's all in how you view it. So, from a therapy perspective, let's take away that walker. Let's administer that Berg balance test. Let's see how they're doing now. And so that hopefully could give you the ability to get that patient into inpatient rehab. So not saying that you want to, alter what is written in the record, but you're preparing a case just like you're going to court. So you want to prepare your documentation so it looks good. Okay, tip. So if, you go through this whole process and you get a denial, what happens is it would be denied at the initial level that the case was entered, then it can go to physician review, peer-to-peer review. So when that happens, at our hospital, our physiatrists are the ones that do the peer-to-peer review. Some places have their hospitalists do that, which maybe aren't quite as versed in the rehab lingo. So just something to think about. You might want to give them some talking points when they do their peer-to-peer review. We have a fair turnaround with our peer-to-peer reviews. We have 2 physiatrists, but they can still get denied. So what happens next is the patient can initiate an appeal. So they call it usually a fast track appeal. And so sometimes if they don't tell you that they have the right, they do. So, you want to push that forward. You just need to keep escalating it. And so if the patient initiates an appeal, our acute care managers help them with that, and you have a really good chance of getting that approved. I bet we have an 85% to 90% chance of overturning that with a patient appeal. So keep persevering through that. The other thing is, in and out of network is something to consider depending on what kind of plans people have. And if they're not, like, I don't know, I can imagine this being a case in Montana if you had somebody from, I don't know, Nebraska up here and we're not in network, then what are you going to do? Are you going to rehab them here? Are you going to send them back to Nebraska? Well, we're not insured. And then see if you could do a single case agreement. So those are some things that you can do to get your patient moved over to your rehab or skilled setting, whatever is most appropriate, and get funding approved for that patient. Okay. So what is the financial situation with that patient? Well, those are hard conversations to have. We don't just disclose to people, like, what are our resources? Do we own land? What about, how much money do we have in savings? What's our insurance look like? Well, now's the time you're going to have these conversations with probably a stranger from the hospital. If you have a discharge planner that really is doing their due diligence, you need to sit down with your patient and your family and start having these conversations depending on what things look like for the next 2 or 3 levels of care. And it's important for the care manager to know what that looks like. Do we have Medicare and a supplement? Can we go to rehab next? Yes. Can we go to skilled after that if we have to? Well, maybe. Some skills won't take you without a supplement. Could you go to a swing bed for a little while? Maybe. Do you need to apply for Medicaid? Well, maybe. There's just so many questions without a lot of answers. So you've got to be asking those questions to help prepare your patients and families for the next steps. So additional expenses, there's medications to think about when a patient, leaves your setting, whatever setting you work in, which is critical because if they're not taking their medicine correctly, what's going to happen? They're going to potentially have another stroke. They're going to readmit. There's going to be complications. There's expenses for equipment and home modifications, but you have that nice program here in Montana, so hopefully they can help you out with some of that if the patient doesn't have funding options for that. Okay, number 3, moving on, we're going to talk about support for the patient and the family. So what's that look like? You need to figure out who is that support person that's going to assist that patient through this process and find out what are their preferences. Like in Montana, just looking at the fact that there's 4 rehab hospitals, I don't know where the patients may be at for their acute stroke care. Do they want to go to inpatient rehab when you've explained what it is? Are they going to have to travel? Do they want to go to skilled care? They want to go to a critical access hospital closer to home? Find out what those preferences are, work with them best they can. The one thing I have found out as far as bringing patients to inpatient rehab, if they don't want to come, you just need to listen to them because it's going to just be a battle the whole entire time they're there, and it's going to be a frustrating point for the therapists, the nurses, the patients, and the families. So just explain it best up front, and hopefully they'll want to participate, and if they don't, then I think people need to be where they feel is the best setting for them. Then figure out their expectations. Are they realistic? If you had somebody that was completely independent, ranching, doing all the things, and now, they're like to assist with transfers and they're not walking, what's that going to look like when they're ready to discharge? So as a family, do they have their head wrapped around what that's going to look like? Or are they thinking in 2 weeks they're going to be independent and going back to all of those activities? So know the level of commitment and the ability to assist from that care partner, and what's the tipping point? So when I ask about that, what is the point that that patient could go home? So if the patient's going to have the ability to have 24-hour care, do they need to be one assist? Well, most of the time they do, in order for that to happen, unless they're able to have 2 caregivers present all of the time. Or is it that they are going to be able to be left alone for periods of time with somebody just checking in on them? So you really need to know, what is that level of commitment from that care partner? So one of the things as far as a tip, we have a care partner program, and I've heard that used today throughout the conference. So what our care partner program looks like is involving that family member in the patient's care slowly and asking them to, initially, they go to therapy, they go to training. So it usually starts out with a transfer. Can you help your patient, your family member, in and out of bed? Can you help them to the toilet? All of these kinds of things. And we have an actual form that we fill out, the therapists fill out, we put it on the whiteboard. And so that way any of the nurses or somebody else that comes in there, and you see a family member transferring a patient before you're like, oh my gosh, what are they doing? It's like, oh, I'm a care partner, I've been trained, I can do this. And so anyway, that can help their confidence so that they know and start building that, so when they go home, hopefully it will be a successful transition. And or it could be a heads up really early on saying, nope, I'm out. I cannot do this. And that happens. You probably have had that happen where patients come to rehab or whatever setting that you're in, and, this is a plan. Family's going to be there 24/7. They get to rehab, and it's like, nope, that's not the plan anymore. And so now you have to come up with plan B. So if you're going to have to move to plan B, the sooner that you know you're moving to plan B, the better. So you can start planning for that. And the AHA has a really nice resource on caregiver learning capacity, and so I'd really encourage people to use that as well. Okay, so number 4, let's have an intentional conversation with the patient and the family. So when I talk about that, I'm talking about a one-to-one, sit down, look at each other, and have a conversation, not when you're, taking the patient to the bathroom or when they're doing therapy or walking down the hallway. And in our facility, most of the time, the person that's having the intentional conversation is our discharge planner, which we have an RN case manager that helps us with that. And the plan is we need to really plan 2 steps ahead. Not just what's going to happen once you leave rehab, but what's going to happen after that and then after that. Because stroke care is a journey, and we really need to do our due diligence to help them with all of those kinds of things. It's important to communicate those discharge goals. So once those therapists have had that chance to do that assessment, the therapists are wonderful, and they have seen so many patients, they can tell you pretty clearly, like in about 2 weeks to 3 weeks period of time, I would anticipate, it's whatever the long-term goals are that they've written, this patient's going to be able to be maybe modified independent, like with the walker. They're going to be good, or they're not, they're going to need 24/7 support. So the sooner you can get those long-term goals and you can get that plan of care established, it's important to have that conversation with the patient and the family. And it's hard having those conversations, especially if it's going to be a slower recovery, because people are still dealing with everything that's happened so quickly. Maybe stroke happened in the middle of the night. They've gone to acute care. They've not had sleep, and they've had tests, day after day. Now we have to make a plan about what's the next step. So these things are all really, really hard having these conversations. But if they come to rehab or skilled or whatever their next level of care is you need to start, talking to them as far as what things look like following that next journey, and be very open with what those goals look like so you can put those services in place. So tip for this is have 3 plans. So when you talk to that patient and family, you'd want to talk to them and say, okay, this is a situation that we're at right now, so we're going to hope for the best. We're going to hope for a return to baseline, to what your current function is and the things that you have enjoyed doing. But you know what? We're going to just plan for the worst, the just in case. Like, what happens if nothing changes from where we're at today? Then what's it going to look like when you leave rehab? And then what happens in the middle of the road? What happens if we get somewhere in between? So have those difficult conversations. Be very transparent with your rehab goals. And sometimes they're hard conversations to have. So who in your family or who in your facility is having these conversations with the patient and family? Well, probably a lot of people. Probably the provider, when they make rounds, they're going to have a conversation. Oh, what's your discharge plan? Where are you going to go? Oh, you're going to go to your daughter's. Okay, that's great. So during therapy, in those 3+ hours of therapy a day, there's a lot to talk about, right? And so a lot of it's like, where are you going to go after rehab? I'm going to go to my daughter's house. Okay, do they have stairs? What does that look like? You start having all those conversations. And so then you have your morning huddle, and somebody says, did anybody talk to the daughter? Has the daughter been to any of the therapy sessions? So it's like, I think we better talk to the daughter. And so in our facility, it would be our discharge planner that would make that call. And hopefully that's all the plan, and it'll all work out. But then sometimes you have the case where it's like, yeah, she can come live with me, but we're going on a 2-week vacation, like right at the day that you've projected for discharge. So now what? And those things happen, and so then, okay, plan B. Everything is very fluent, with discharge planning until it happens. I always tell people, you just have to be prepared for absolutely anything that could potentially happen. So planning. Okay, so this is just an example of a referral tool that we use at our facility. So this is all just practice based from my experiences that I'm sharing. So, I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth here. Like when I'm talking about discharging somebody from rehab and the frustration that, they maybe don't have funding in place or a solid discharge plan. Well, the same thing happens to the referrals that come to us. Like, what are the first things we ask? Like, oh, do they have a discharge plan? What's their funding? Who's their, so it happens all over sober, and all the different levels of care. But this is just a tool that we use to help coordinate the referrals coming into us, to keep track of, who's going to be ready when, what's the situation look like, what are we anticipating for a length of stay. So as a 13-bed unit, and we do stay pretty full, we can kind of figure our in and out plan together. So just a tool to think about depending on how you organize your referrals coming into your facility. Okay, so just want to talk a little bit about competing priorities, and this may not be a subject matter for everybody, but as far as like our rehab unit being a part of an acute care hospital system, this gets to be a challenge. I don't know if you're part of a system or even, if you're a standalone situation, but there's competing priorities. In acute care, they're all about length of stay. The push is getting patients out quicker, sooner. But as soon as we talk about that, then the other metric acute care is worried about is readmissions. Like, okay, well, get your patients out fast, but be sure you don't readmit them. And then, there's the financial needs of the organization. So, like, what if you have a patient that just is stuck? They don't have funding, they don't have a discharge plan. What are you going to do? Pretty soon that length of stay is growing on acute care, or it could be on rehab, or it could be on skilled. And then you're like, And pretty soon you start having leadership, like knocking on the door saying, hey, what are you doing with the patient in 3309? They've been here X number of days. What's the discharge plan? People start getting real inquisitive, like, where are we at with moving this patient to the next level of care? So just want to share a tip and a tool. So at our facility, we have what's called a complex case team meeting. We meet once a week. And so what we decided to do was we're going to involve the whole team and all stakeholders and all leadership. So everybody, we want to be transparent about these patients in our facility. And anybody who has an idea to assist with that transition planning is welcome to add their 2 cents. And it's been very enlightening, I think, and educational for our leadership to realize how difficult discharge planning is. I mean, there's just no fairy dust out there, and it's getting less and harder all the time. So in this particular slide, the key points of this, like it has, the patient's name, room location, who the care manager is following that patient, physician and whatnot. But the key things that we're looking at is length of stay. So this is like on our acute care. Anybody who's been on acute care greater than 7 days, anybody who has charges over $100,000, and anybody who is green for discharge, like from our acute care hospital, meaning they're ready to discharge, but we have no place for them to go. Those are the people that will be talked about at this meeting. And unfortunately, we have a list of these patients. So what's the discharge plan for almost every single one of these patients? Well, let's send them to inpatient rehab. That'd be a great plan for them. So that's when we have to get a little protective of our program and the integrity of our program, just like whatever programs that you guys are in. So just a suggestion or thing to think about, this may not apply to you. We can also take our rehab patients that we're challenged with, and then we bring them to this meeting as well. So it's not just acute care patients, but those patients that you're like, wow, discharge A plan just fell through. So we want to have some more input from other, leaders and stakeholders in our hospital so everybody knows about the situation. So you can make whatever metrics you want to make, but I just think it's a good way to keep everybody in your hospital or rehab unit or skilled unit apprised of the patients that we're taking care of. Okay, number 6, moving on to social determinants of health. Talked a little bit about that earlier. So depending on where you look, there's different things that are listed for social determinants of health. In this particular slide from the World Health Organization, they talk about income, education, unemployment or job security or insecurity, working, ability to access food, housing, early childhood situations, social inclusion, structural conflict, and access to healthcare services. So there's been some new rules with CMS that as far as we're needing to collect this data and screen our patients for this on acute care. And then after that, they're looking at how many patients screen positive for having any of these issues. So in our hospital, there's a referral then that goes to our social work department that can help address what are these issues, because these are the real discharge issues that keep our patients readmitting and not being successful at home. So this is something that we're going to be seeing more and more of. And I think it's a good thing, just kind of like our complex case meeting. This is a way, hopefully, for a greater cause for, like, say, policy development, and what are we doing to support people in our society that are struggling with these issues. So that is out there, and obviously a discharge challenge. Okay, medical complexities, number 7. So a lot of stroke patients have medical complexities and comorbidities. Different things listed up here are just hypertension, diabetes, AFib, tobacco use, and then there's all the secondary stroke prevention things, DVT prophylaxis, and so forth. So those are things that we have to address while they're in the hospital, and we need to plan for when they dismiss, because we don't want our patients to readmit. We want them to have a successful discharge plan. So how do we do that? We need to make sure that they have a PCP they're following up with. So hopefully they already have somebody, but sometimes we have patients that come in, maybe they've moved to our area, and they don't have a PCP. So now what are we going to do? So, we take the time to figure out, where do they want to get ongoing care? Do they want to get it like in the city where they're getting inpatient rehab, but they might be from 2 or 3 hours away, so that's not feasible either. So then you're making calls to the smaller outlying areas. But whatever we need to do, we do, right? So we can have their connection to their healthcare providers. And then we have issues for prolonged wait times for procedures and tests. Sometimes with discharge planning, it's like, they're in the hospital or they're in rehab right now. Let's just do a colonoscopy while they're there, because that way they don't have to travel 3 hours back. And we're like, no, time out. You can't do that. So then you have to educate your providers that, no, you can't add all these other tests on just because they're at a medical center right now or close to more intense medical care. So that's something that's a challenge. And then also sometimes working with multiple specialists. There's a lot of specialists that can get involved, neurology, hospitalists, depending on if they have other comorbidities that they might be seeing. So who's really running the show as far as when is this patient ready to have the next level of care? So you need to figure that out in whatever setting that you work in. And just the patient's readiness. When are they medically stable to transition to the next level of care? And my suggestion is you want to double check that when you're bringing somebody into your facility. Get their most recent labs, get their most recent vital signs, any med changes, because what you consider medically stable and what a hospital or a discharge service might consider is medically stable can be two different things. So you don't want any surprises, or you want to minimize the surprises anyway. Okay, so transition planning and resources for creative discharge planning. So the ideal discharge is for them to return to their previous home at their prior level of functioning. That's the plan. So just a tip, one of the things that we do early on is we consider what's called a home safety evaluation. So we'll go within a 60-mile radius of where our hospital is and actually do a home visit. So the therapist will go out to the home and then have them go, up and down their steps, in and out of their bed, their favorite chair, the toilet, types of things, just to make sure they can access everything, remove the throw rugs, all the typical home visit types of things. But to actually go in and do it in their home setting is very enlightening, and it really helps build the confidence of the patient. Or it might be a time where you're doing that just to say, this is just not a good plan, and they just have a different opinion until you can do a home visit. Then hopefully that can reinforce why a different plan might be better. Maybe they do need to go skilled care for a period of time. Now that's not always feasible, so then we'll do like a home video assessment. So we'll figure out who their care providers are, and then actually have them, go through the home. It's nice if you can do it FaceTime, like with the therapist and the patient together. So it's kind of like having a virtual therapy session, from afar. So you can do planning together to figure out what accessibility looks like there. So something to think about on that end. Equipment ordering, that's always important to start talking about with discharge planning, especially if it's going to be a complex case, when you need wheelchairs or specialty wheelchairs, those types of things, walkers, canes, they're easier to get. One of the things that we do is car transfer training. So we have a little I don't know, module car that we can have the patients practice to get in and out of up in our therapy gym. But let's do real life. So let's have them get in and out of their own car. So have the family bring the car up. I mean, so is it a car or is it a 4-wheel drive truck? So that can be a different thing. But what's the patient going to go home in? And what are they going to get in and out of once they leave your facility? So, if it's a 4-wheel drive truck, bring it, because we got to figure it out. So whether you get boxes or curbs or, the therapists are just, crazy and genius into figuring all of these things out, but let's figure it out. And then there's the RVs. We even have that in Nebraska, the recreational vehicles. So how am I going to get in and out of my RV? Because that's where I'm living. And so it's like, well, okay, how many steps to get in? What are the heights of the steps? How many inches? So you got to ask the question so you can start incorporating that into your therapy. Family care partner training, we already talked about that. Another thing that we do, which we have had success with, is towards the end of the patient's rehab stay, we have like a safety commitment form that they sign. Makes all the risk management people in the hospital crazy because we're letting these, fall risk people up ad lib. But it's like, they're going home in 2 days, so we've got to figure it out. Let's get rid of these alarms. Let's see if they're gonna, what's gonna happen. If they're gonna fall, it's almost better to have that happen here so we can, help educate them, on the whole thing and get up from a fall. So anyway, so we have this safety commitment form so that PTs are the ones that really drive it. And they say, yep, we're able to have this patient be up ad lib. We feel comfortable with that. So then they go through with the patient and describe, what the safety commitment form means, and then they sign it. And again, it's not saying that they're not going to fall or they're not going to maybe do something unsafe, but again, it's an intentional conversation. It's kind of that teach back method so that they truly are understanding that commitment that they need to make to stay safe while they're in the hospital, and then again, when they dismiss to home. Community integration program. Again, I think that's important with discharge planning. Practice having them get out and about in the community, go to the grocery store. How are they going to get their groceries when they get home? So the more you can practice that, either in a simulated setting or actually take them out and about for discharge planning, I think that that's really key. And then how are they going to manage things at home, their medications, and then the blood pressure monitoring? The kits that you guys are going to be able to give out are just, that's great. Because people don't always monitor their blood pressure, even when they know that's what's caused their stroke. So be able to give that to them, that will be very important. So you might have to think about alternate discharge and community resources. So if everything aligns, the patient has a good recovery, you get your equipment, they've got a good support system, you can send them home, wonderful. But that's not always the case. So sometimes, they still need just a little bit more rehab, so swing bed, skilled care could be an option. Going to a family member's home instead could be an option. Hotels, sometimes it's just like, well, nothing's accessible. Well, there's maybe a local hotel you can stay in town and be close to therapy on an outpatient basis. Homeless shelters, those are the less appealing discharge plans, but sometimes it is what it is. I know we've sent patients home that we're feeling so uncomfortable with, and, we called all protective services because we're just like, this is such a high-risk situation. We've instructed, we've educated, they've declined services, and, it's not that we're, quote, turning them in, but we just want them to be safe. And sometimes APS can go out there and help do some things and get them some funding, perhaps to have electricity and heat in the winter and some of those types of things, even running water. It's amazing the things that you run into. Okay, so just a couple more things under number 8. So making sure the patient and the family really understand what's going to happen next and what does that therapy plan look like. Make sure that they can repeat that back to you once you've established that. Hiring caregivers, I think that's sometimes something that gets overlooked, but sometimes having a caregiver go into the home for just even 3 hours a day, 3 times a week, can make all the difference in the world to keep somebody at home for just a little bit longer. Our chore service is available. I mean, the most obvious, can somebody just come in a couple of times, every other week to clean the house? So that's one less thing that the patient or family have to, think about. Food prep plans, people are great, food prepping on whatever health kick that they're in, but we need a food prep for our patients when they go home. What can they go and they grab that they can, cook easily and quickly. Nutrition is very important. The medication plans, the med packs, all the pill organizers to make sure their meds stay, organized and they're taking them consistently. Lifeline is a system that's been out there for a long time, but there's other systems out there too. Like there's one that's called I Am Fine program. It's $10 a month, where you need to call into the program before whatever timeline you set up. So like say you typically would get up at 7, so by 8:30 you would have called into this program. Well, if you didn't call in by that time, then this program's going to call whoever you've identified as your responders. So it kind of works a little bit in opposite of Lifeline. Instead of you placing the call with a Lifeline button, this one is if you don't call, then they're going to alert you. They'd call back to you first, but then if you don't answer. So there's just several of those kind of systems that are out there. Okay, transportation, I mentioned that earlier. Returning to driving is tough. And at our support group that we have, this is the number one thing that people stress about is transportation. And what is that going to look like? Because they know that they're not going to be able to drive. So how are they going to get to these important PCP appointments? How are they going to get to outpatient therapy? How are they going to get their groceries? Well, some of that we can take care of now. I mean, you can drive through Walmart on your way out of the hospital and pick up some groceries to go, or some of your meds. But if you're in a rural area, that's a really tough thing to think about. So you need to identify with your patient who's going to be their transportation care partner, per se. Could be a neighbor. But resources for transportation, those are tough. Outpatient medical follow-ups, besides your PCP, you want to make sure for discharge planning that they are going to have ongoing connections with their neurology and their rehab specialists. Diabetic education is one that's really hard. I feel if they're newly diagnosed as a diabetic, to make sure they get all of the education that they need to manage that when they leave. But if they don't have it down, it's going to be a serious problem, for them, and they're going to be readmitted. So just a few other things, really simple things, reminders. Anymore, everybody has a phone, a smartphone, a tablet. So just pre-program for them, like when they're supposed to take their medicines. You can put that in as reminders or put that in as an alarm. So if they can continue to take their meds consistently, that's a huge thing, or for follow-up appointments. One thing that was pointed out to me was, a family member told me about this, was a reverse home mortgage. And they did that for their mom so she could get resources to pay for caregivers to come in so she could continue to stay in her home for as long as possible. And I'm like, wow, that's a great, clever idea. And it's not for everybody, but it really worked out for them. So, for some of our patients that we're working with, the best knowledge is to find out what are they accessing right now and how are they staying at home successfully. Then there's always technology with Alexa. So Alexa can tell us, what time to get up in the morning. They can also help you with reminders for meds and for those kinds of things too. Okay. So number 9, so if you can't get your patient to inpatient rehab, let's bring inpatient rehab to the patient. So as far as a creative discharge plan to consider, so whether that be like in a swing bed setting or a skilled setting, where therapy is provided, is there a way you can bump up that therapy amount to a higher intensity? We've heard a lot about that. Can you get to a 3-hour-a-day plan between PTOT, speech, whatever is needed there? And just make sure that it's really a philosophy change. Those patients, they're up, they're dressed by 8 a.m. They're not having, any meals in bed. They're going to a common area for meals if at all possible. And the key thing to all of this and the people that I've talked with is the schedule. We have a schedule in our rehab center, and I know other rehabs do too, that the patient gets every day, and they carry that with them constantly, so they know exactly what the structure and the schedule of their day is going to be like. When you get to, I can't speak for swing beds, but I know for some skilled settings close to our area, they struggle with doing that because there's too many variabilities. But if a person could kind of get over that hump and could give that structured schedule to the patient, and even if you have to just put something in where at 9 o'clock, maybe it's not going to be PT, but they can do their exercises on their own. Lower extremity exercises at 9, then at 10 you're going to get PT, and so forth and so on. The more active they can be, the better. we heard about that earlier, just those little boxes. If this is the amount of a day that's filled with therapy, so let's fill it for them. So see what we can do to try to bring that rehab philosophy to the patient no matter where they're at. Even if they're going home, have them work a schedule out with them before they go home. Like, okay, let's talk about what this is going to look like at home. Or if you're going to have outpatient therapy, this is when you have your outpatient therapy. And this is when you have your down days. So this is what you're going to do, in between. So this is just a tip and a tool. So one of the things that we do at our center is we have a daily huddle sheet. And so this is, we switched to Google, so now everybody can access it at any time. And so we have all of our patients organized by name, any special needs that they have, where they're going to go for their discharge plan, what their goals are, what their funding is, what their next review date is for their insurance, what equipment they're going to need, what discharge needs they're going to have. So we can have that all on paper, printed out for the entire team to know that there's no surprises when it's time for discharge and the equipment hasn't shown up. This has helped us tremendously. And then we keep track every day. So we figure out their CMG, so their length of stay. It's like that first patient, I don't know if you can see it or not, but the CMG is 14 days. And so we're on day of 14. So we just keep changing that. So then we're on day 10 of 14, 11 of 14, 12 of 14. We're getting closer. Are we on track with everything? And then as we get closer, then the case manager will put what exact time they're going to discharge and who they're discharging with. So then the nurses can help organize their day of what's happening when. And then we know what time we can bring our next admission in. So this has been something that has really kept us on track. When it's on paper, everybody from your team can access it. It's been helpful. So just a little bit about equipment. These are kind of your typical things that you would see in a rehab unit with some of the different pieces of equipment. But this is what I really wanted to point out was on the top left up here. And this is something that we were able to purchase with our grant money from the grant that we're a part of, is that, you can have all the fun bells and whistles of equipment that you can get, which is wonderful. However, what's meaningful to your patients? So they wanted tools. We wanted regular tools. So the director of therapy and I, we went out to Menards and we bought a tool bench and we bought tools, and the patients can be happier. And they're doing woodworking projects with, real screwdrivers and, some safety drills. It's not for everybody, right? Yeah, to make sure that it's a safe plan. But anyway, so those are some of the things. And so if you can do that and help with your creative discharge planning of what is it safe that patient's going to be able to do when they leave. So you can assess their safety while they're in rehab so you can give good recommendations for when they actually discharge. Education's important, following up support's important to help with the discharge planning. This is a kit that we had created at one point to help us with monitoring for blood pressure, giving that out to our patients. So we're going to take a quick pause. I think we've got, are we done? Are we at an hour? We're okay. We have a few minutes. Okay, so I'll buzz through the rest of this pretty quick. If you want to hand this out, we're going to do a case study quickly. Jana, maybe you can hand that out to half of the room, and then this to the other half. So I'm going to read these case studies, and if you guys could just take a couple minutes at your table to talk about this. And what you think, using that tool that we had earlier, what would you recommend for a discharge plan? So for case one, the case one is Jennifer. Jennifer is a 75-year-old woman with a left cerebral stroke resulting paralysis of the right arm, weakness of the right leg, and difficulty speaking. She requires moderate to maximal assistance from most ADLs and walking with a device. She needs supervision for feeding so that she doesn't overfill her mouth and is on a mechanical soft diet. She has fluent speech output with no hesitation. However, the output of what is said is empty and contains made-up words. She produces the following when looking at pictures of her grandchildren playing in the park. This one is words and sentences. That one is a polyesterman and is so wild no one knows what he is doing, so they just start at his being told. And then the social history, she lives in a rural town in Montana with a spouse who is somewhat frail, active in civic affairs, has family living within 60 miles, and the funding is Medicare, and she has a supplement. and prior level of functioning that she was independent and still driving. So that's case 1. So you guys take a look at it, that you have that at your table, discuss that, and figure out what you would recommend for her discharge plan. And then the case 2 people, I'll just let you read through your case on this side, and then we'll just talk about that. Okay, I haven't given you a lot of time, but just to keep moving since we're running a little bit over. So the case 1 people, who has case 1? Over here? Jennifer. So what are you guys going to do with Jennifer? Where do you think, what would be a good spot for her ongoing recovery? You have a plan? Let's hear it. Oh, go ahead.
It'd be inpatient rehab. I think she's a perfect candidate for inpatient rehab.
Yeah, I would think so too. Any barriers that you see?
Well, the rural is the one thing that triggers me to immediately start thinking about what her goals are, what her homestead, transportation,
Right.
what resources are available to her, because that stops everything if I can't get her the resources at discharge. So find out what else we can use to keep her safe at home.
Good. Anybody else back there have anything to add to Jennifer's case? No? Got it all? Okay, good rehab candidate. Jennifer's a good rehab candidate. We're going to admit her. Okay, let's talk about Jack. What are we going to do with Mr. Jack? Anything on this side for case study number 2?
Kind of on the fence between inpatient rehab versus outpatient rehab. And I was just saying sometimes this person could be a perfect candidate for a shorter inpatient rehab stay, so just like a week to get up to more of like a supervised to mod-I level, and then be safer to go home with family, and then I'll continue to do outpatient.
Yep. Anybody else want to add anything to case study 2, Jack?
That needs to be in Billings where his family is,
Okay.
okay? And because also, if the family and he don't click, it's extended family. So if
Yeah.
they don't click, I know that he can go to a skilled bed
Uh-huh.
or or a non-skilled swing bed and get outpatient OT and PT readily in Billings.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
his family would be available for some interactions, which would be helpful to him.
Kind of, transitioning him home. Yep. I like those thoughts. Anybody have anything else to add to Jack? Vision therapy? Yeah. So what do you guys think about the Medicare Advantage part? You think he's going to get approved or not? Yeah. Yeah. What were you going to say?
Should be provided to the patient and family, and they decide first.
Yeah. So, I think they're good cases. I had added a couple more things in there. I mean, because I like the idea of on the case for Jack. Well, let me just talk about Jennifer first. I do think Jennifer is a clear-cut rehab candidate. I mean, pretty black and white. Got Medicare Part A and B. I think that, they're from Montana. I think that is a great option. Yeah, definitely there for Jennifer. Now, Jack is a little bit more challenging because he's a little bit more mobile. But he's 57, goodness sakes. This guy, I mean, I'm sure could still be, did it say, yeah, is he working? Yeah, he is. So what about the fact that he's from Florida? Are you going to do rehab here, or are you going to send him back to Florida? Rehab enough to go home and then go back to Florida. Okay, and I mean, the good thing is he does have some extended family here. So I like the idea of the short-term, rehab stay. And we do that a lot where we'll look at somebody who's moving around pretty well. We're like, probably a 5 to 7 day stay. And by all means, if that was me, I want my shot at a 5 to 7 day stay. I mean, don't take that away from me. I mean, give that to me to decide that. And so, and see how that's going to go with the family. So you have some options there. Yeah.
One thing I would definitely promote is that short-term inpatient rehab stay in Billings, so that he's closer to his medical team, his
Yes.
neurology, his neurosurge team, in case something goes wrong in those early days.
Absolutely.
Rather than being in transit or get home and, he has a whole new set of caregivers and team over there that don't know his situation.
Yeah, that's an excellent point.
Did you guys hear that? Would recommend staying close to the medical team where he's been at for his acute care, in case something goes wrong before traveling that far from home. So, okay, lots to think about. Every patient's different. Okay, I'll keep moving. So program considerations, just things to think about, whatever program you're in, is just know your data. Collect and know your data. Don't forget about patient experience. How are they thinking about their stay? Establish your outcomes. Make sure you're completing follow-up phone calls because you learn so much about what went well or what didn't go well, and share that with your team. Learn from those patients and families. Have a steering committee and make sure it's comprised of some of your direct care staff, so that this information and decision-making power is a part of the whole group. And then establish your goals for continuous process improvement and share all of your data with your whole team and facility. I mean, everybody owns that data. So the top 10 discharge considerations for creative discharge planning. I don't know that I sprinkled any fairy dust, but I touched on a lot of different topics. Each one of these could be their own hour-long presentation. But the last one I want to talk about is just support, integration, and meaning. And so I think this is what you have to talk about from day one. Like, what gives your life meaning? What's on your bucket list? What are we going to do to get you to make sure that you can achieve those things? And so if you can keep, the rehab plan, wherever it's at, centered around that, and then you can keep your patient buying in. So when they do have their down days, you can bring them up. Because just like us, every day isn't an up day. And so when they have those down days, it can be rough. And, the therapist and the team, they're there to be those cheerleaders. And then, celebrate that recovery. So what does that look like? So one of the things that we do is we have what's called a code rainbow when our patients leave. Not every patient, but some of our patients that have really undergone some big obstacles that they've accomplished. And we page it overhead. The patient gets to select a song that they want to have played overhead, which brings meaning. The guy here walking, he picked Eye of the Tiger. It was just great. And he's like, and I'm walking out. And so anyway, and it's just so valid. I mean, it's just so emotional. I'm always a video taker. Just for the patient and the family, like what they've accomplished, we need to celebrate that. And then it's also so reaffirming to your team, because your team puts so much into these patients. I mean, just you think about them when you go to bed at night. Our therapist will come to work the next day. Like, I figured it out. I know how we can get that patient into that RV. I know how we can get that patient into that truck. I mean, you don't work in rehab unless you're 100% engaged and all in, no matter what setting you're working in. So, okay, well, sources, resources, and questions. Sorry, I went a little bit over. Anything? Yeah. Okay.
That eliminate your ability to do a peer-to-peer?
No,
Like,
The patient-initiated appeal comes after the peer-to-peer.
So if you start with, the patient starts with that.
It's just kind of a process, escalation process, is that, you do your normal review, ask for like an expedited review, and then if it's denied, goes to peer-to-peer. I know what you're saying. Can they just do it then? Because the problem with the patient requested appeal is it takes another day or two. Then your acute care people get real antsy because they're wanting those people out of the hospital. But you want the best care for your patient, so they need to hang on until they get the answer. But
More and more where the peer-to-peer is actually occurring before the insurance will make a determination.
No.
we have not experienced that. Have you?
That in Montana, the
Really?
insurance will say, we're not saying yes, we're not saying no, but we want a peer-to-peer. So
Oh.
they get the hospitalist. 'cause
Okay.
That's what is at our local hospital.
Yeah.
To talk to the insurance company, and then they make the determination after that phone call whether they will say yes or no. So they haven't even made a determination yet.
So you think
They're
they're
just seeking more information to make a decision.
See, and it means no.
yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, maybe they're just seeking, and we'll get requests for more therapy records or sometimes more information. Yeah, I would make sure that's when you want to have some really good therapy notes, some really good objective, like standardized testing that they've done, and maybe give those hospitalists some talking points, because they don't usually talk the rehab lingo, like how far off they're off from baseline. And this is a rancher, this is like, we are not there. They deserve their chance.
LifePoint, who is what Rehab Hospital of Montana is under, they're creating a tear sheet that has language so that hospitalist
Yes.
has some rebuttal when the peer-to-peer person quotes some page from some document.
Yep.
They are able to come back with a pre-programmed statement to challenge that.
Oh, that's excellent.
Excellent. Yeah, that goes right along with the webinar I just listened to about Medicare Advantage plans, and it quoted all of the new rules out there for Medicare Advantage plans that they need to follow. And so I bet that's the verbiage that they're quoting. That's excellent. Good.
The medical reviewers, they don't have to be close to that discipline, right? I mean, the dermatologist could be the reviewer, is that, or can you request legally?
Yes.
And so that's the one thing too they talked in that Medicare Advantage webinar is you can request someone that has rehab knowledge to make that determination, because it could be somebody that's just, I don't know, a random not rehab knowledgeable person. It's like next in my queue to review this. Yeah, so you can request, I wanted someone with rehab knowledge to review this. And
That you could, like, say, like,
Yeah, that's according to the webinar I watched.
that was one of their talking points, was to request that.